we're looking at, of course, 1 Samuel, and as we move into 1 Samuel, we went through the Judges, and the Judges is kind of a culmination of the people moving into the land. And what seems to be the main sin in the book of Judges? What's the sin that the people continue to commit in Judges?
Idolatry.
They kind of continue to commit idolatry. They worship, and why is that so important or at least as the writer of the Judges portrays it? Why is that such a big problem in the book of Judges, that the people continually commit idolatry? And by the way, what is idolatry? Just so we're on the same page. Okay, worshiping anything other than God. Okay. Why is this such a huge problem? Why is this a problem?
Because then when something wrong happens, they're asking God to save them.
Okay, good. And if we say God is in control, right, because that's also sort of a theme, why would bad things be happening? If God is in control, why are bad things happening to his people when they commit idolatry?
Because they're not obeying God.
Okay, and why is that a problem? What exists between God and his people?
Covenant.
Okay, yeah, a covenant exists. So there's an agreement that if you do this, this will happen. And that's really important because we're going to see that in what we're looking at today. A covenant that's going to be restated, but shaped a little bit, changed a little bit. But that becomes a problem. That God has a covenant with the people. You obey me, but more particularly, you worship me. Obedience in terms of worship. And I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to protect you. But if you don't, then I'm not. And they break the covenant over and over again, right? Throughout Judges. And what's the pattern in Judges that constantly repeats itself?
We have no king.
Well, one, they have no king. What?
God appoints a judge.
Okay. People worship other gods, right? Punished. And how the punishment is always the same. It's not famine. It's not disease. It's oppression. Some king or people that live in the land start oppressing them. The people cry out to God, right? God does what? Sends a leader, and the leader does what? What does the leader do?
A lot of times, nothing. A lot of times they don't lead.
Well, in the book of Judges, what do the leaders? What do the judges, the ones who appointed judges, do? With one exception, Samson is a weird one. Mm-hmm. So you almost have to take him out of the equation because he really doesn't fit that pattern as well. But interesting, Samuel does. Samuel has this good judge pattern. People cry out, judge is appointed, and then the judge does what? Leads the people and they defeat the enemy. And the judge rules and the people are at peace and the enemy is pushed away and everything is wonderful for a time. And the judge dies, and what happens when the judge dies? People fall away, and you got the pattern repeating itself. So there's a pattern that repeats and repeats and repeats. And we see that in 1 Samuel. As we enter this phase of the story, we've got this same pattern lurking in the background, except as you look at the condition of Israel, what direction has not only the judges, but Israel kind of taken through the book of Judges? Do we see them on the ascendancy? No, we don't. We see them go in decline, right? Because at the end we got these nasty stories about the tribe of Benjamin, and they're just bad stories, and that don't involve judges, but really how far God's people have fallen from the time of Joshua, when everybody was focused and everybody was serving God. They're kind of a mess. And then we're into Samuel, And what is Samuel's backstory that makes him interesting?
He was given to God.
Okay, and when you say given to God,
He was,
in a very literal sense,
Right.
he was given by his mother to a priest, and the priest raised him. And what ended up happening to Samuel? And we got a lot of stuff about Eli the priest and his sons and the Ark of the Covenant that the redactor of the story is going to come back to, because it's sort of in the background now, and he'll come back to it a little bit later. But what is Samuel's situation? So Samuel is with Eli the priest, and while Eli's sons are rotten, Samuel is good. Samuel is good, and in fact Samuel grows into a judge, right? Because he travels around and he leads the people against the Philistines and all this kind of stuff. So he fulfills the role of a traditional judge, and he rules over the people for a time. But the people want something. What is it that the people want? And we had an illusion about this at the end of Judges. What do the people want?
They want a king.
They want a king. And as we look at the people wanting a king, or even the role of king, we've got, even in the writing, that presented sometimes in a positive way. You know, the people are running amok because they don't have a king. On the other hand, it's presented in a negative way, because by wanting a king,
They're going to become slaves.
they're going to become slaves to the king. What else are they doing?
They're not worshiping.
Yeah, they're not worshiping God. They're turning away from God. So this idea of a king we see presented here with fragments of stories or whole stories that are very, very different, that are moving in different directions, which is kind of interesting. Remember, the guys who compile this, they're not stupid. They know that we're moving in different directions, but they include it anyway because they believe that's important in the story. So we read it, and it's almost like we get the sense that having a king or not having a king isn't a universal good or evil. It's maybe, could be. So it's more complex than just saying it's wrong. Although there are places where Samuel says, it's wrong. But there are other places where he's excited about it. So it gets a little confusing. And even in terms of how the king is selected. And we're going to see today a third interpretation of how Saul became king. Which is, again, interesting because we've already had two. One was really positive and the other one not so much. So they want a king. What's the process? How do they end up with? And when we start today, we kind of got a king. How do they end up getting a king?
Which story do you want?
Give me both of them. Let's give me the first one first.
Whenever Saul was looking for donkeys.
Saul was looking for donkeys.
And he met Samuel, and Samuel anointed him.
Anointed him, right? And what happens in that story and Samuel's inspired to do it. God is directing because Samuel says he is. You know, God told him he was going to meet a person on the road, and that was going to be the king. And what happens to Saul after he's anointed?
He doesn't tell that.
Okay, he doesn't tell his uncle, but something happens between his anointing and him telling his uncle that becomes kind of significant to understanding how Saul is going to be presented, even in what we see today. What happens to him as he's going home?
He was prophesying.
Okay, he runs into that group of prophets. And the group of prophets, how are they described?
As seers.
Well, they all kind of seers. Now, I'm thinking in terms of what they're doing. They're prophets.
praising.
Okay, that's there, singing and dancing and praising God and full of the Spirit.
Can I ask a question
Yeah.
about that? Because when I read that, were they Philistines? They weren't.
No,
Okay.
no, they weren't
The way
Philistines.
that reads, it's kind of hard
Yeah,
to.
they aren't Philistines.
I wouldn't have thought they
No.
would have been. Okay. Thank you.
But they are prophesying, right? But they're doing it in an ecstatic kind of way, an otherworldly way. And who joins them?
So,
Saul ends up joining, and what happens when he joins them?
He dances.
Yeah, he dances. He's filled with the Spirit, and he's prophesying and doing all this stuff. And that's kind of important because then Saul, this is going to be one of those characteristics of Saul as king, is it's going to be almost an inspired kind of kingship. That it's going to be more than just earthly. Now that's one story. Very positive about Saul being king. This is a good deal. And maybe the best part of the whole story is they found the donkeys. They found the donkeys. So, all right, so we got this one story. Now, what's the second story? About how Saul becomes king. We got this little story about the Saul and the donkeys and, Samuel meeting him on a road and anointing him and filled with the Spirit and all this kind of stuff. And then we've got another story that sounds like it picks up right before the other story starts. If you took this out, it flows. And this one is all about what? What is the second story about Saul being found, being made king? What one is that? How is that one described? In fact, how does it begin? Which tells us immediately about how Saul is going to be viewed. Having a king is not a good thing, right? This is not a godly thing, but we're going to do it anyway because God has heard you, and so God said, go ahead. They're making a big mistake, but appoint him a king. And then you remember how Saul is identified? He isn't on a road looking for donkeys. How is he identified?
As the king?
Well, remember, they take lots. They call all the people and they start taking lots of tribes and then of clans and then of families. And they finally come down to Saul's family. But where is Saul?
Hiding.
He's hiding in the baggage. He's hiding. Which isn't a great impression of a king, that you're going to have to find him among the luggage. This is not a good thing, but that's the one who draws the short straw, so he now becomes king. So we've got these two stories about Saul becoming king, one of them much more positive about him than the other. The other one isn't really very good. All right, so we've kind of got a king here, right? And then at the end of chapter 10, we've got a little sort of an introduction into chapter 11, because we've got a character introduced we hadn't seen before. And who do we see? We talked about him last week. Who do we see introduced at the end of chapter 10?
Is that the king of the end?
That's the king of the Ammonites, right? And what is he doing? Nahash.
that's
What
the
is-
beginning of, that's
Yeah,
the beginning of 11.
What is he doing?
He was gonna
Leaving his army.
Oh,
take their eyes.
yeah, he's really oppressing them, right? He's oppressing the people. In particular, what people is he oppressing?
Gileadites.
Okay, the Gadites and the Reubenites. Now, Gadites and Reubenites are members of the tribe of Gad and Reuben. And what made the tribes of Gad and Reuben unique among the tribes of Israel?
They were east.
They were east of the Jordan. So they weren't in the promised land, they were east. They were in an area called Gilead. So they were east. And so we've got this Ammonite king who is oppressing the people, and he's putting out their right eyes, right? whether it's because of the shield, like Janet said, or whether it's, depth perception, it is certainly, when the king does that, he's exerting his power. And he's demonstrating without any question that he is in control of these people because he's able to do it. Okay, so like cutting off thumbs. I mean, this is a display of power. Now, in this part of the story, though, he doesn't do it to everybody, right? Who gets away? Who escapes Nahash? We got 7,000 that go to a city of Jabesh, Gilead, Jabesh, because there's a lot of Jebushes around, east of the Jordan. Now, what does the king do to these 7,000 Gadites and Reubenites that escape to this city, to Jabesh? What does King Nahash do?
Offers a treaty.
Well, he besieges them, right? Right at the beginning of chapter 11, he besieges the city, and what do the people in that 7,000 that have escaped there, what do they want? What do the people besieged in the city, what do they want from this Ammonite king?
They don't want them to put their eyes out.
Yeah, they don't want him to put his eyes out because that's what's going to happen if he takes over. They want some kind of treaty, right, with him. And they're willing to do what as part of the treaty? They already make a concession. What do they say that they'll do if he agrees to make a treaty with them?
Be his son.
Okay, they will serve him if he makes a treaty. And he says, okay, but what am I going to do? Yeah, you're going to be eyeless. You're going to be wearing a patch, right? You're going to be saying "R" a lot and having parrots on your shoulder because that's the way it is. Yeah. Okay. Now, so that's the deal. I'll make a treaty, but your eye, you're going to lose an eye. You're not going to get out of that. Now, what's the response of the people in Jabesh?
They want 7 days.
Okay, give us 7 days. Of course, 7,000 in the city, 7 days. All of these are perfect numbers, so they want 7 days. And what are they going to do in the 7 days?
They're going to send messengers throughout Israel.
Okay, they're going to send messengers throughout all of Israel. And what is the goal of sending these messengers?
To see if somebody will listen.
Okay, if somebody in Israel will help them. And what do when the messengers go out, what do the messengers find? Okay, they go to Gibeah, right? And who is hanging out in Gibeah? Saul is there, and the messengers tell the people there, and so they're Jewish people, right? Gibeah is in Benjamin, on the other side of the Jordan, and the people are really, really sad, right? Because they're crying. Now, how is Saul described in this? So, Gibeah, people are sad, that's where Saul lives. How is he introduced into the story?
Working out in the field.
Okay, he is working out in the field behind oxen. So he's doing what?
Plowing.
He's probably plowing in the field. Now, that's kind of interesting because Saul is out there plowing his field. What has happened to Saul twice? What has already happened in the story to Saul 2 times?
He's
He's been made king twice, right? Because we got him once on the road, and then we got him once drawn by lots, and now what is he doing?
He's working.
He's behind a yoke of oxen, so he doesn't exactly
Look like a king.
look like a king or sound like a king, right? Okay. Now what happened? But there he is. behind the load. What happens to Saul when he hears the story?
The Spirit of God came.
Okay, Spirit of God comes on him, right? And what happens when the Spirit of God comes on to him?
He was burned with anger.
Okay, he feels angry. Now, we saw the Spirit in this other story about Saul, right? On the road. He's filled with the Spirit and he begins to prophesy. So we've got this again. But Saul here isn't being presented as a king. He's presented as a farmer who clearly carries weight in this area, but not as somebody who has been anointed once, much less twice. So what does Saul do?
Cuts up oxen,
Okay, he takes his oxen. And what does he do with them?
cuts them in pieces.
Cuts them into pieces. And he does what with the pieces?
Sends them out with messengers.
Okay, sends them out with messengers. Okay. And this sounds a little familiar, right? When did we see this sort of thing happen before?
With the Benjamites, whenever they were looking for the person who had killed the concubine.
Right, the Levite and the concubine. That's what the Levite does and cuts her up and sends the pieces to the different tribes. So same sort of thing is happening here, which means, they're drawing stories from different places. And how do the people respond?
They were afraid.
Okay, they're afraid of who?
So,
The Lord.
Well, they're afraid of the Lord, right? And what do they do? So they interpret this as when they get these pieces of the ox, the people are afraid of the Lord, right? And what do? Because remember, Saul says, Saul and Samuel want you to do this. How do the people respond to these ox pieces?
they came together.
Okay, they come together. They come as one. And how many people end up coming?
300.
Okay.
30,000.
300,000 come from where?
Israel.
Israel. Is that all? No. Who else is there?
30,000 from Judah.
Okay, you've got more from Judah. Now let me ask you, why are they describing so many from Israel and then so many from Judah? That sounds like what? What does that sound like?
Division.
It sounds like a division. Like Judah's not part of Israel. Why do you think the writer would do that? Why would the writer separate out the ones coming from Judah? What might that tell you about him and about his audience? That he would separate it out. Because he doesn't say so many from Israel and then so many from Ephraim and then so many from Judah and so many from Dan.
You think
He
he
doesn't
was
do
an
that.
Israelite?
What's that?
You think the writer was from Israel?
Well, could be. Certainly could be. If he's from Israel, that would infer then that there's a division between Israel and
So they're not united.
Judah.
And Lord might not be with them.
Well, maybe the writer is writing in a time when Israel and Judah are separated. And we know that's going to happen. But much later than this is supposed to take place. This is after Solomon, David's son. And we haven't even had David introduced yet. So Israel and Judah are going to become two separate countries. Kind of tells us that this is being written much later than this is occurring. Because it's written by someone who sees a difference between the two. And he's writing to an audience that if you said Israel, their assumption would be it's coming from Israel but not Judah. Because we're talking about two different countries. Okay, so that's just kind of interesting. This person is writing to real people living at a certain time. So he's writing in a way that they would understand. To them, Israel and Judah are two separate places. Okay, so what again, so the people come and gather together, 300,000 of them. And what are the messengers? So we got messengers still there. What do the messengers do? The messengers that was set out by the people of Gabish, what do they end up doing? When all these Israelites and people from Judah come, what do the messengers do?
They reported back.
Okay, they go back.
They were coming.
To Jabesh. And they report that we got help on the way, right? And how do the people of Jabesh that are looking at losing an eye, right? How do they respond?
They were elated.
Okay, they were elated. Now, you still got Amorites, right? And they're besieging the city, surrounding the city. And that was a big deal in the ancient world because, remember, if you have walls around your city, it's pretty hard to get in. You know, when you can't blow them down, you don't have cannon or anything to knock holes in the wall. You kind of had to wait them out. And you did that by cutting off food and water. So that's what a siege was. So who ends up showing up? So the Amorites are surrounding this little city. You got 7,000 in the city. They get a word that deliverance is on the way. And what happens with the Amorites?
They were slaughtered.
They are absolutely slaughtered by who slaughters them? Saul. Saul comes with his great big army of 300, almost 400,000, and absolutely slaughters the Amorites and saves the city, right? Okay. Now, how is Saul acting here? We've kind of seen this pattern before. What does it appear as though Saul, what's his function? How is he functioning as he leads this army of Israelites to save the people from the Jews, the Gadites and the Reubenites in the city of Jabesh? What role does he seem to be playing?
The leader?
He's serving a role as a leader. Now, to this point, before all this came to, who served as leaders? What did they call the leaders?
Judges.
They were called judges. And in a sense, that's kind of what he's doing. He was a farmer, came in with his ox, told about this problem. Spirit falls on him, ends up going, leading the people, breaks the power of the Ammonites, and saves the people of Israel who are besieged in this city. Okay. Now, sort of serving the role, kind of functioning as a judge, and since in this story we don't have mention of him being king, we just have a mention of him doing this. So I think this may be like a third, because we're going to see what's going to happen a little bit later. What happens after the battle?
They renew the kingship.
Okay, the people say to Samuel, what? What do they say to Samuel?
This is the part I couldn't understand. They
Yeah.
said, who was it that asked, shall Saul reign over us? Does that mean there were people that didn't want Saul to reign over them? Because then it says, turn these men over to us so they may be put to death.
What what appears to be happening, if we didn't have anything else mentioned, we didn't have those other two stories, what would seem to be going on here? What would seem to be happening in verse 12? They want him to be king. That the people say, we want him to be king. Why would they want him to be king?
He just saved them.
He just saved them. Like, duh.
But there was a group of people in the first story. At the end of the first story, there was this one line about some men
who weren't happy with him being king.
Is that who they're talking about here?
Well, I think it could be sort of an allusion to it, whether it was the writer creating it or whether it's in the story. This story seems pretty distinct, complete in and of itself. That these are the people who are, lifting, after the victory, lifting Saul up and saying, that's the guy we want to follow. He's the one we want to be king. Which kind of explains why Saul is looks like a farmer at the beginning of the story, isn't functioning as a king at the beginning. That this is another kingship story, and Saul then becomes king because he wins his great victory and the people want him to be king. So we may have 3 different stories involving Saul being king. In a sense, all of them reflect some things about Saul. That become important to sort of integrate into how we see him. And we'll look at that in just a second. Now, so we've got these people that say, we don't want him. Some people, we don't want him to be king. What does Saul say about these people?
No one will be put to death.
Okay, nobody's going to be put to death. Now, who is he pointing that towards? That nobody's going to be put to death today. In particular, who is not going to be put to death? The people who didn't want him to be king. In other words, Saul is saying, even though these people are against me, I'm not going to put him to bed. I'm not going to put him to death. So we're going to have what? Present in the people.
Unity.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We've got this division that Saul is choosing to accept, right? By this promise that he makes. Now file that away, because this is part of who Saul is. What does Samuel say?
Come, let us go to Gilgal and reaffirm the kingship.
Reaffirm the kingship.
For the
Although in this we haven't really had a kingship, or at least Saul didn't seem to recognize it as he was plowing his field. And the writer doesn't say, understand Saul's a king, but he was humble, functioning as a farmer. It's not mentioned until here. And so what ends up happening at Gilgal? They made Saul king, and they have the party and all this other stuff. Now, so we've got these 3 stories, all dealing with Saul being king. And the writer could have, because he's putting together a bunch of stories. I tell people, like when you look at the gospel, visualize it, the evangelists are doing the same thing this person is doing. Imagine sitting at a table that's covered with little scraps of paper. All of them having to do with Jesus. Little stories about Jesus. Because the evangelists, they're writing, Mark is probably writing 30, 35 years after Jesus is gone. Luke and Matthew are writing around 900. We're talking about almost 60 years after Jesus is gone. That's a long time. And they, in an ancient world where you don't have anything printed, they're looking at a pile of papers, little scraps of paper with stories on them. Now, all of them have an idea of why Jesus is important. And they've got this whole pile of papers. And what they're doing is they're going through the pile and they're trying to create one narrative that includes all these stories. That's what he's doing here. We've got all these little stories. We know it's late because he says to the people, his audience, some from Israel, some from Judah. So he's talking about a time that's like 500 years after this is supposed to happen. That's a long time. Maybe not 500, maybe 250 years after. That's a long time. So, maybe not even, maybe 100 years. But because it's after David, it's about 100 years. Could be later than that. The earliest is 100 years. He's writing this much later after this. He's putting together a story. Now, the question then becomes why he could have taken only one. He could have used only one story. I mean, that would have been easy. Just take one. But he includes, and he has an idea about why the king is important. Why would he use all 3? Now, I think he's shaping all 3. So we wouldn't know what they originally looked like when he got it. So he's shaping it into his narrative. But what do each of those 3 show about Saul that we might want to know later? Like in that first story with Samuel on the road and anointing Saul, and then Saul going back home. What did we learn about Saul in that little story that if he hadn't included that one, we wouldn't have known? What did we learn about Saul as a person, and then maybe as a king?
I thought it was interesting that he cared about his father's feelings.
Okay, good. We see something, we see it in this one too, don't we? A little bit. That Saul cared about his father's feeling. In this story, we see him
Caring about others.
Because as a king, even as a pre-king, as a leader, he should have done what? What would have been the astute thing for him to do?
Killed the people that were opposed.
Eliminate opposition. The last thing a king wants is a whole bunch of people that don't think he should be king. That's not a good idea to keep them around. But Saul did. So he cared about his father's feelings, and he didn't kill these guys. So we got Saul showing compassion, but maybe compassion to a fault. Compassion leading him to do something that may not be a wise thing to do. Like, when somebody's governed by the heart instead of the head, leads them sometimes to make bad decisions because they're being guided by their emotions. So in these stories, we've got that. Now, we didn't get that at all, the guy hiding, in the luggage. But these stories give us that. What else do we get? What happens to Saul in the first anointing story, the first kingship story? After he's anointed, what ends up happening to him? You remember we mentioned it a little while ago.
Well, that's when he meets up with
the prophets, and he is prophesying and filled with ecstasy and really is going to it. Mm-hmm. And that's alluded to in the second one, that the Spirit comes on him. So we've got somebody who is Spirit-filled, right? That also may kind of point against somebody who is really reasoned. He's kind of acts on the Spirit guides him. That's something. So you want to file away. This is a guy who's guided by the Spirit. Now, when he makes this decision right here to spare the people, and he says not to kill him, that was something that he just said, right? It didn't appear as though he thought about it a lot. He just made the decision that he was going to do it. That's something else we want to file away. That Saul may be a little bit on the
Soft side.
Well, soft side and also rash side. That he makes promises that might not be the best. May have consequences later. But he's doing it quickly without giving it a lot of thought, planning it out. Now, I think that's why we've got, and the middle story with him hiding is still this idea that, he's got weaknesses. He's certainly not a perfect person. So we have this impression of Saul that we get from all three of the stories that we wouldn't get if we only had one. Or if we only had two. And I think you could compare that to the Gospels. That's why we've got 4 Gospels. Because they're not identical, but what they do is show us 3 different impressions of Jesus. Therefore, what we want to do when we look at the Gospels, same thing we do here, is we don't want to try to squeeze them into one story, because then they contradict one another. But we let each one of them show us who Jesus is, and all of those taken together gives us his identity. Same thing I think is happening with Saul. That's why he's got these 3 stories that are kind of connected, but really could stand all alone. Okay, but no matter how you cut it, by the time we enter chapter 12, Saul is what?
king.
Saul is king. And something else So we're on to something else when we get into chapter 12, right? Where does the focus shift in chapter 12? We've been dealing with Saul, right, for a while.
We're talking about Samuel.
Now we're
Back to
focused
Samuel.
on chapter 12. We're focused on Samuel and what's happening with Samuel.
He's getting old.
He's getting old, right? And he's already, now he's speaking to Israel, right? And what does he say he's done?
He listened to everything that the people said to him.
Okay, listen to what the people said and gave him a king. So I've given you a king and now I am old and gray, right? Okay. And I've led you from the... So what does it sound as though Samuel is doing?
Retiring.
That's exactly what he's doing. Samuel is retiring or getting ready to die, which is sort of the ultimate retirement. But Saul is ready to exit the stage. You know, I gave you the king. I am now old. I've served you from the youth. What does he ask?
He goes over the whole history of...
Well, even before, you're right, but before that, he asks something before he gets to the history, because you're right, spot on. What does...
Never cheated.
Yes, he goes into this, have I ever cheated you? Or not even, I haven't cheated you, have I? He goes, now, why is he doing that? Why would he do that?
Well, he says, if I have done any of these things, I will make it right.
Okay,
He
so
wants absolution.
yeah, he wants to retire with
Dignity.
a clean
Clear
slate,
conscience.
that clean slate. He has done what? He has turned in his keys. They've gone over his books. He is ready to retire, right? And what do the people say when he says this?
He hasn't done it.
He hasn't done anything, right? And even wants them to make sure they understand. So they say he hasn't done anything wrong. Therefore, Samuel says, since you said that, when we stand in front of God, I'm innocent. I'm fine. You know, I haven't done anything wrong to you. So the slate is clean. He is now ready to exit. And now what does he tell the people? Now what does he go through with the people?
The whole history.
Now he's telling them this whole history. And the history involves,
Moses.
yeah, it goes to Moses, and then there's some big jumps, right? Because he talks a lot about Moses, and then all of a sudden he's...
Jacob.
Well, it's kind of interesting because he talks about Jacob and his family going to Egypt, and about Moses and Aaron leading them out, and then all of a sudden he is in the book of Judges, you know, and he starts talking about the judges, and not all of them, but you know, some of the judges that are doing, which again, as we look at these stories, because remember the judges were regional, you know, that these were the judges, whoever has written these stories, whatever region he's from, these are the judges that were significant for those people. And those are the judges that, and at the end, what has he done at the very end? When the Ammonites were there, what did the people want when the
Give him a king.
Give him a king. So again, that's sort of the second story. You know, that's when the people wanted a king because the Ammonites were dumping on him. And what has Samuel done, or what did the Lord do using Samuel? Gave him a king. So now you have a king. Again, kind of interesting because according to this, the reason they have a king is because of the Ammonites doing what they did. Okay, so he's done this work. Now, what does he say in verse 14? And look at it really carefully. When he starts talking in 14 and 15, what is Samuel? Now he's talking to the people, right? and he's getting ready to leave the stage, and he's reminded him what the Lord has done, all the way out to the Lord giving him a king. What does he say? And it's really restating in verses 14 and 15.
He's warning them not to let history repeat itself.
Okay.
Like in Judges,
Okay. He doesn't want history to repeat, therefore he's challenging them to do what?
Obey God.
Obey God. And we know about obeying God, right? But in this, it's a little different. In a sense, what is he restating? That we've seen people state, Joshua did it, Moses did it. What is he stating? He's stating a covenant, right? Obey God, God's going to be with you. Disobey God, God's not. Man, that's a covenant. You got two sides. But this one's a little different. How is this one a little bit different than the covenants we've seen before?
because it says that both you, meaning the people, and the king.
And the king. Now, why is that difference significant?
Because before, when you had the leader, he led the people, they were like one.
Okay.
And now with a king, it's showing like a division to start with, the people and the king.
Okay. Are the people and the king linked? If the king disobeys God, what's going to happen? The people are going to suffer. If the king disobeys God, the people are going to suffer. Now before, if the people disobey God, then the people suffer, right? But they didn't have a king. Now, if the king disobeys God, because the king and the people are linked, the people are going to suffer. So the destiny and the lives of the people are going to be connected to the king. Now, why is that really dangerous for Israel as they move into the future?
Because the king's over the people.
The king is over.
If he makes a bad decision, all the people's going to pay for it.
Yes. Not only are they going to pay for it because the decision was bad, that he made a bad economic decision, but if that king disobeys God, the people are going to suffer. The covenant is with the people, but is being shaped by the king. And do the people have control over what the king does?
No.
That's not what kings are not controlled by people. That's one of the problems with kings. So we've got a real shift in the covenant here that's being made. Now the king is going to represent the people. And I think the reason that's important is as we get further into this story, the focus is going to be more and more on the kings, not on the people. Not on the people. It's going to be the king and God, but not the people and God. And when we look at more of the stories in the books of Samuel, particularly the books of the kings are going to be, the people are going to be judged based on the quality and the spirituality of the kings. And the people are going to suffer and bad kings, whether the people deserve it or not. The assumption is whatever the king is doing, the people are also doing. And that's a real shift. That's a real shift. And I think it's more in the way the story is presented. We're not going to be dealing with the people sinning. Now we're going to see that a lot in the prophets, but the prophets aren't part of this narrative. They're something different. That's more and more this history of Israel is going to be the history of the kings. Okay. Now, what does he promise?
Promises if they persist to do evil, that they will perish.
There's a little strange little thing in what Samuel says in verses 16 through through 18.
About sending the thunder.
Yeah, about sending the thunder and the rain. What's that all about?
Because now he's pointing out their failure, their, what do I want to call it, their action to ask for a king. So they were granted a king, but this was a bad move.
This was a real bad move, and we see that in the new covenant, that they're going to be judged based on their king, that they're going to be judged, and in fact, this thunder and lightning, is this a good thing?
No, because it's the harvest, the wheat harvest.
Yeah, this is bad time to have thunder and lightning and rain, right, when they're trying to harvest, right? And this is a consequence of the people doing what?
Not obeying God.
Not obeying God by wanting a king. So this is why we kind of bounce back and forth with this king business. Sometimes it appears as though the kings are good. This is a good thing. Other times, like here, and we had before, let me tell you what kings are going to do. Kings are not good. And I think that's reflects this attention that's there in the story itself. That on one hand, kings are going to can lead you to great spiritual victories. On the other hand, kings also reflect turning from God and following human beings. And that becomes dangerous. I find that really interesting, when it talks about the nation is going to be judged on the quality of the leaders. What if we're judged on the qualities of our leaders?
Oh, boy.
We're not now.
Well, I mean, what are we going to, but that's kind of what's happening here. That's the deal you've made. Wow. I'd rather not think about it. Okay, so, and so the people, when these thunder and lightning, when this happens, what's their reaction, the reaction of
What we've seen before, they want help from the Lord.
Same sort of thing. This judge pattern. This is really bad. Help, please, Samuel, help us, right? And what does Samuel say to him? Which may also be what God says to us.
Pray to God.
Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Not because you were great people, because what you did is wrong and stupid, right? But still, you can turn. You can turn back, okay? And that the Lord is not going to cast them away. God isn't going to cease to be their God. And as for Samuel, what is Samuel going to do?
He's going to pray for him.
I am not going to let you go. I am going to pray for you. But you know what? If you keep doing evil,
You will perish.
You and your king.
you and your king, you and your king are going to perish. Okay. Now, in this, what is this writer establishing here? Because this is, as we read this is Samuel doing what? What is Samuel doing here? In this whole chapter, in chapter 12. What is Samuel doing?
He's retiring.
He's retiring. He's leaving he's going to leave the story, right? So we're going to expect him soon to die. We're going to expect him to die soon. And so this is sort of like his final words as the story is being written. In these last words, what's he doing for the future of the narrative? What are we going to expect to see in the story that follows chapter 12?
Disobey.
We're going to continue. We're going to continue to see disobedience. We're going to continue to see what else? People disobeying. We're going to continue to see that. What else are we going to see?
Asking for forgiveness.
And we're going to see people asking for forgiveness. Same thing. We're going to see in between disobedience and asking for forgiveness.
worshiping idols.
We're going to continue to see them doing evil, probably worship, following other gods or worshiping idols or doing something.
Follow the king, right?
But now we're going to have less focus on what the people are doing and more focus on what the king is doing.
And his past will prevail.
Oh my goodness. And we've got a king, Saul, who is good looking and tall and certainly brave because he won this great battle. But he's not perfect because he's also tends to be rash, and he also tends to be a little soft-hearted. Now, we've seen that too before with Eli, because his sons were awful. We even saw with Samuel, because remember, his sons weren't anything to write home about earlier. So we see kind of this compassion leading to problems before in this story. And that's something we see as a characteristic in Saul. So we see this king who has feet of clay. And that we might expect to be a problem later, but not immediately. Because even though he beat the Ammonites, where were the Ammonites? Where did the Ammonites live? In proximity to the rest of Israel, where were the Ammonites? Because remember, they were dumping on the Gadites and the Reubenites. Where were the Ammonites? East. The big problem most of Israel is west and south, right, of the Jordan, right? And who is the continuing problem? They've been a problem at the end of Judges. They've been a problem throughout, half of Samuel. Who is the big problem west of the Jordan?
Philistines.
The Philistines. The Philistines are the problem. And so if Saul's going to be king, he's going to have to deal with the presence of the Philistines that are still, because remember, we even had mentioned they had garrisons in tribal areas. They had garrisons around. So the Philistines are still there, and they're still strong. If Saul's going to be king, he's going to have to deal with the Philistines. Now, he should be able to do it because the Spirit is on him, and he defeated the Ammonites, but he's got these characteristics. He's got these characteristics that may be a problem later. Quirks in his character that may be a problem. Okay, any question about what's going on here? We do see a shift. We're going to see a shift in the story because Samuel, who's been the kind of the protagonist so far, is going to become is getting ready to leave the story, but he's still got one really important thing to do. He isn't going to die as soon as you think. He's going to be around for a while. He's got one really, really important thing to do. So he is kind of going on in retirement, but he hadn't left the scene. He's not going to die in 13 because he's got something else to do. Okay, let's have a word of prayer, and then you can do play in the rain. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together, and bless us as we go about our living. Remind us that, that maybe leaders and people are tied in some way in your sight. Not sure how, but maybe they are. Help us be aware of that and act accordingly. In the name of Christ we pray, amen. I will say though with that, and it just kind of hit me, we see an allusion to that in the book of Matthew. Because if you look at Matthew 25, beginning in 31, verse 31 of 25, this is the last word Jesus gives to his disciples. After this, they go and have the Lord's Supper. So this is the last teaching Jesus gives. He gives 3 stories in chapter 25. The story of the 10 maidens with their lamps, the story, I can't remember the second one, but this is the end, and it has to do with the Son of Man returning. And what's fascinating in the Son of Man returns, and he's going to call people in front of him. But the word used that is used in the Greek is ethnoi. Now this is chapter 25, 31, beginning of 31. He uses the word ethnoi. Now ethnoi in Greek means nations, because the Jews believed you had the Jews and then you had the ethnoi, everybody else, the nations. And he doesn't say the laos, and Greek laos means people. He doesn't say the people are going to be gathered in front, even though your translation, I'll bet you $5, it's going to say people. It doesn't use the word laos, it uses the word ethnoi, which is more properly translated nations. It's nations in King James. That he's separating the nations, the sheep from the goats. And the sheep he puts on the right side and the goats he puts on the left. And when he talks to both of them, when he talks to the sheep, he says, come into my kingdom that's been prepared for you from the foundation of the world, because I was hungry and you gave me food, I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink, yada, yada, yada. And they say, well, we didn't see you. When did we see you hungry? And he said, when you do it to the least, you've done it to me. And then he goes to the others and said, you didn't do this. And they say, when did we see you? We never saw you. We didn't see you hungry, we didn't see you thirsty. And then he says, when you didn't do it to the least, you didn't do it to me. And then there's a separation. Well, like I said, the Greek word is ethnoi. So if that's the way it was intended. Now, when he said ethnoi, was he talking about individual people? Maybe, I don't know. But he didn't use the right word if he was. Then maybe that's the same sort of thing that's happening here, where the people and the leaders are connected and the judgment of the leader goes to the people. That this is sort of what Jesus is saying, something similar, when the Son of Man comes and divides nations based on what, not individuals do, but based on what nations do. So, and why does he say, I don't know, because there's no grace in that little story. There's no what, but there's an out for those who are Christian. If you believe in me, you don't have to worry about it. He doesn't say that. So how we take that, I don't know. But it's very interesting. It didn't hit me until just a minute ago that there's, kind of that Old Testament, New Testament. What the leaders do, people may have theological implications to hold everybody. So just throwing it out. I'm not even sure the connection just hit me. So
What's the chapters for next week?
Next week we're going to look at 13 through 15:35. So I think it's through 15. So it'd be 13, 14, 15. And we're going to see, in it we're going to see Saul. Saul is going to reach his peak. He is going to reach the top. And he is going to come crashing down. So he's going to reach the heights, and guess why? He's going to be brought down by these qualities we talked about. These qualities are going to trip him up. And he's going to come down, and he's going to come down hard. But not fast. It's hard, but it's going to be a while before he really comes down. Okay, good. Thank you.